What do you think of when you hear the word mourning? What about grieving? So often we use these words interchangeably or to reference outdated or old-fashioned traditions and practices. But the truth is we still use these every day to process any sort of loss. And in this video, we're going to break down the differences and similarities and how you can better understand your own grief process and that of those around you. So let's get into it. Welcome back. My name is Aurora and I take my formal education in psychology and my real life experience and combine them together to give you a whole and complete view of mental health, grief, and addiction. Today we're talking about grief and mourning, how they're different and how they're similar. So in the most basic definition, mourning is everything that is the outward expression of loss, and grief is the inward process of loss. But it's much more complex than that, and we're going to break it all down for you. But real quick, before we get started, I'd love to know a little about where you are in your process. Are you grieving? Are you here to relate and support better with those around you that are grieving? If you could just put in the comments below where you're at, I would love to know more. I'd like to start by talking about mourning. So this is all of the outward things that we do when we're experiencing loss. And these can change greatly based on your culture and your religion. Even age and demographic can alter these things. And mourning has changed over time. But basically, these are things like attending services, memorials, maybe wearing black, or even listening to a song just to remember someone. All of these can be acts of mourning. If you remember at the start of this video, I asked you what you picture when you think of mourning. And if you're like me, this might be what comes to mind. And that's because for hundreds and even thousands of years, society had a very structured idea of what mourning looked like. Women would wear black for long periods of time, not dating or marrying, and there were very strict practices around mourning. But whether you are mourning in a very structured way or in a more organic and free-flowing way, however you express loss is mourning and it is valid. So mourning and grief can go together, but mourning cannot exist outside of grief, whereas grief can happen without mourning. I know that's a bit confusing. Let me explain that for you. So the moment a loss happens, the grieving process begins. But grief can start with shock and denial. And so until we acknowledge grief and acknowledge a loss, mourning can't start. But once that grief has been acknowledged, then mourning becomes the vehicle through which we can better propel ourselves through the stages of grief. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross discussed 5 stages of grief. Now, they have been kind of argued since then. Some people think there's 7 stages. Some people think they're not relevant at all. But either way, grief and mourning happen only in the middle of the grief process together. So with mourning, we don't follow stages of grief. Mourning exists for tasks. There are 4 tasks of grief, and it's said that when these 4 tasks have been accomplished, then mourning can end. And so the tasks are, the first task is acceptance. Now, this can and can't be accepting the loss entirely. Mostly, I feel that this task of mourning is to acknowledge that it happened and be able to admit it to yourself. And once that happens, and it's usually done with funerals and things like that, where we're really, coming face to face with the loss. Once that happens, then the next task of mourning is processing, right? We have to process it and really understand what has happened and the ramifications, how that will affect us now, and what life's going to look like now. So after that, the third task of mourning is reconstruction. So reconstruction, let's say that you experience a loss and you take some time off work. Reconstruction is going back to work. It is setting the pieces back up again. It is trying to begin to rebuild a life that has this loss with it. So the fourth and final task of mourning is called upward momentum, or the upward spiral. And that is where, as we're reconstructing our life around this loss, we begin to find a healthy and stable balance where we are accepting, acknowledging, and respecting our loss, but we are also finding peace and joy to some degree in our own life, and that the grief and the loss are not hindering our life at all. They aren't keeping us from living a happy life anymore. So once the tasks have achieved their goal, mourning can subside, but it may not subside fully ever. Because you think about, if you've loved someone very deeply and you lose them, you may continue to celebrate their birthdays with a memorial. You may continue to, my brother, for example, my necklace I wear every single day has a bit of his ashes in it. So every day when I put my necklace on, I am doing a small act of mourning. The grieving process does continue, I believe, indefinitely. It's a little controversial. Some people believe that once acceptance is achieved, that the grieving process stops. But I believe that grief lasts for the rest of your life, because this person was a part of you. And depending on who they were, they may have shaped who you are today. And so with every memory you have of them, every time you think of them or remember them, or any item that you have of theirs, with that, you will always be actively processing acceptance for the rest of your life. And so that is really what grief is. Grief is all of the inward stuff. Grief is the feelings and the emotions. Grief is how your body responds to a loss. So this could be insomnia, loss of appetite, depression, physical pain and illness. All of those things are part of grief. And so the 5 stages of grief are thought of as really segments of the grieving process, but they can be gone through out of order. Some people may not go through all of the stages, so they're not so strict. It's really just a guide as to, this is a common series of events that you will experience if you are grieving. But the main point in grieving is that everyone does it differently. It's different based on how you felt about the person. It's different based on your religious and cultural beliefs. And all that really matters is that you are finding a way to find that balance of peace and memory that brings you some sort of clarity and a sense of resolve to it. All right, so that is the differences, similarities, and overlap of grief and mourning, but that is just a very basic sort of overview. If you want to know more about grief, definitely check out my video right here. It'll tell you a lot more on how you can find peace inside of it. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.